Chapter 7. On the night of our departure, the air was electrified with my excitement. In the cellar-like room, I packed the necessities like hairbrushes and clothing, which my Lana had bought for me since I was unable to retrieve my things from home and no longer able to go into town. Rumors of me alive spread like wildfire. On the evening I saved that man in the tavern from being beaten to a pulp, someone from the crowd recognized me. He spoke to my father saying I was very well alive and was a madwoman that persuaded, then killed the abuser out of cold blood, although no one saw me do the deed. They were out looking for me, rather I should say, hunting me. There was a life to be paid for, and for that life I felt nothing. The fact that I killed him didn't pain me in the way it had with the young boy. David was innocent. The other man was ruthless and extremely cruel. I had stopped packing the long flowing dresses, shawls, shifts, and corsets as my thoughts completely distracted me. I couldn't believe I found peace in killing, but when I killed someone that was wicked, it did not distress me. Milana's words crept in my head. Feed on the evil-spirited souls. It is easier. You know they should atone for their sins with their death. And she had been right, dreadfully right. But now I couldn't help but feel guilt at that. What gives me the power to act like God? That is too much of a responsibility to measure someone's purity and humanity. What if I made a wrong judgment? I sighed and shook my head in an attempt to clear it and continued packing silently. A short while later, my Lana sauntered into the room, her midnight blue dress trailing behind her.
Ah, you were getting ready. Excellent. We have to leave right away.
She did a quick spin and looked about the room. A quick sigh escaped her lips. Milana turned to address me.
We have everything?
I believe so. I quickly looked down at the trunk I had been filling with my items. There were 4 altogether, 2 for clothing and such, and 2 larger ones for us to take shelter in. Did you retrieve my harp and diary? I had asked Milana to get them for me, for she still had to feed and was going out. I hoped she would gather a few things I didn't want to leave behind, but ultimately, what I really wanted to know was how my father was.
Yes, I picked up your things,
she answered as she made her way over to the trunk and began adding the odd perfume bottle or canister of body powder. Did you see my dad? I asked carefully, fearful for the dreaded response he might be dead.
Yes, I did see him.
Milana's head peered up over the lid of the trunk and looked at me, but quickly hid her face again and began to speak, her voice tender.
He was sitting at the kitchen table, passed out. I had no trouble getting in or out. He never knew I was there.
Milana stood up, straightening her body, and made eye contact with me.
Other than that, he is well. I did stop to see if his heart was strong.
I sat down on the edge of the trunk. I missed him already and worried for him.
He will be fine,
Milana added, trying to console me. Unfortunately, it didn't work. I knew my father would not be fine. As we continued to pack the last of our things, Milana talked of the place we were headed, Boston. The thought of being on a ship for 2 months frightened me. What if someone were to find out about us? And when we run out of Milana's blood wine, are we to feed only on rats? Or on the odd human on board ship? The thought of befriending a mortal seemed preposterous to me, only to know what could happen, what would happen, his inevitable death. I did not trust myself, my willpower, or my self-control. I lacked the understanding of how to hold back my thirst. It is a skill with that familiarity it would become easier over time, Milana assured me, and of that I was certain. I just didn't know how long it would take, and all I could do was hope and pray that it would be quickly learned. As I closed the lid and buckled the straps shut, I heard a team of horses pull up outside. It was time, and there was no turning back. Milana and I carried our trunks up to the kitchen, leaving them there, having the 2 young coachmen carry them to the carriage. Once we were on the carriage and our belongings were loaded, we started to roll forward. Never look back, I told myself. If I did, I would go insane from grief. Our cabin wasn't much, but at least we had one. There were many who had to live in the bowels of the ship in the worst conditions imaginable. Nightly there were fights among the poor, and many developed scurvy and diphtheria as the weeks passed. They were the ones we fed on, death most merciful. We were playing God. One evening I woke up in a funk and I couldn't shake the feeling of angst and unease. Sitting in our cabin, I was fixated on a dancing flame that burned brightly on top of the candle. I refused to leave that night to search for another human that cried out to die. I was killing up to 2 a night, my Lana taking 3 or even 4 into her deadly grip when she would become upset over something and was unwilling to confide in me. After a month and a half, the deaths on board never aroused suspicion. It was only assumed illness had taken their lives. The healthy, which mainly consisted of the wealthy, only feared becoming ill themselves. For a while we lived off of the blood wine, then the animals on board ship. In my mind, I thought, why kill humans? Why not feed from the animals only? Nothing horribly terrible happened, so I decided to test out my theory and was not going to kill humans anymore. It had been nearly 3 weeks that I did not consume human blood. The odd time a rat scurried by me, I quickly grabbed it, slit its tiny throat, and drank them dry. I hated the taste of their blood. It wasn't as sweet or full of flavor and life as human blood was. Not very often did I feed on rats. I found their blood sickened me so much that at times I felt as though I would vomit. Sucking on fur was not my preferred choice, but when I need the bloodthirst calmed, I would give way to it. When I did feed on animals, I found my body more susceptible to the cold, my flesh more sensitive and sore to touch. Milana, who glared at me, sat opposite me at the small table. Giving me the silent treatment, I knew she disapproved of my decision. Finally, annoyed by her own thoughts and arguing with herself, no doubt, she finally addressed me after 8 nights of silence.
You'll have to give up this crazy notion that you can live off the blood of animals only. It is fine for a while, but sooner or later it will affect you, and that will harm you even more. You will truly feel like you are not human.
Milana finally said, breaking the silence. I didn't answer her. I continued to stare at the light that emanated from the candle. I could feel her annoyance grow, but really there was nothing else I could say to her that would make her understand. I had already tried, with no luck. So to try again and hope for a different result would just be insane.
Fine. Fine. Be that way. It is your life, such as it may be.
She rose and walked through the little doorway, her lavender skirts exiting the room last. She turned around and looked at me one more time, about to say something, but only shook her head and slammed the door shut. I was tired of being trapped on this ship, stuck in that room. I could have gone out and roamed the large vessel, but I did not want a chance running into my Lana. I stood from the tiny table, making my way to receive my clairshach, an Irish harp. I brought it over to where I was moments earlier and sat down. Placing the harp between my knees, I played with the right positioning, and once it was comfortable, I placed my hands in the starting position and began to pluck at the strings. At first, it was soft and controlled, but as my emotions took over, I played in a frenzied state. The music that flowed from my fingertips released all my emotions into dramatic and sorrowful melodies. For hours I played, the exertion causing sweat to bead on my forehead. Finally, after feeling I had exhausted all emotions I held onto, releasing them into the universe, I stopped. I placed the harp aside and just sat. I was numb. I wanted to do nothing. I was emotionally exhausted. Later that evening, my Lana came back, her face flushed pink, her exposed skin looking human again. The sight of her like this quickened my pulse. She was still very beautiful to me, yet too evil to look at. Walking in, she laughed quietly to herself as she headed directly for the little vanity table and sat down. Her skirts spread outwards and rustled around her. "Why are you so joyful?" I asked a little bit too bitterly. I couldn't look at her. Turning my eyes to look at the candle that had shrunk considerably, my face a mask, I made sure to reveal no emotions.
Oh, don't be so depressing. And for heaven's sake, stop avoiding me and look at me!
Milana's voice becoming louder and irritated. She slapped the small table, causing the bottle of perfume to jump. I looked up at her finally, but I kept all emotion and thoughts from her.
Thank you. But I mean, really look at me. Show me that you are in there.
She waited for some kind of change in me, but I refused to change my facial expression just for her, to make her feel more at ease.
Fine. I gather you were like this because you were starving yourself.
Suddenly she rose, walked toward the door, and let in a young man, his scent instantly filling the room. He appeared to be about 16, very pale and gaunt. Dark blue circled his eyes, making them appear like they had sunk inside his head. The sight of him made me want to cry and sickened me simultaneously.
This is Stuart.
My Lana's voice sounded sweet to me, but I heard the underlying malice in it.
The lad wanted to see the upper part of the ship. I thought I would show him our little room.
She turned to the young boy with a small grin.
What do you think?
She asked him sweetly. I was dumbfounded. I didn't know what to think of all this. Deep down, I knew why she had brought him here.
Well, what do you think?
She asked again, this time gesturing for him to enter the tiny room further. Milana wanted me to feed, and this boy was to be the sacrificial lamb. I vowed I would not give in to her. I was never going to drink human blood again. The boy examined the room in awe. The room itself was not much. A small round window on the farthest wall from the door, which we covered during the day to block out the sun. A small wooden table placed by the door along with 2 decorative chairs. Beside it, a few feet away, sat a vanity table. Perfumes and powders cluttered the top. They weren't a necessity, but the scents for them were wonderful. A twin-sized bed sat opposite the 2 chairs, and hidden discreetly behind it sat our trunks. Stuart was one of the many poor populace that were shoved into the lowest levels of the ship to endure the heinous conditions of disease and famine. He had, from what I could tell, the symptoms of scurvy. His illness was severe, his heart beat erratic, and I could sense his body dying rapidly. Being near him in that small room made me uncomfortable, for I hadn't been near mortals for some time now. As Stuart stood there, I saw how the bones in his face protruded painfully. His cheekbones being so high hollowed out his cheeks. I could graphically picture the rest of his body, able to see every rib and bone, skin-covered bone, no muscles, just a living skeleton. He gradually made his way from the doorway over to my Lana's side. Every step he took, he did so carefully, limping. His joints swollen, his movements were stiff and jerky. With every movement, his face grimaced with pain. Once by her side, my Lana placed her arm gently around his shoulder, Stuart enjoying the love that she offered him.
Deirdre, Stuart here is an orphan. His parents died about 4 days ago. The poor boy needed someone. I hope you do not mind the extra company.
She took her gaze from me, glanced down at Stuart, and smiled, not bothering to hide her fangs. I stood there shocked and dumbfounded. He had to have seen her nature. Why wasn't he afraid? Why wasn't he running out of the room? I shook my head in disbelief. Milana then sat him down at the table, and there the 2 of them talked for what seemed hours. I sat on the bed watching and listening to their conversations, which were rather dull, and the whole situation was morbid to me. At times they would just look into each other's eyes and say nothing, and I knew she was speaking to him silently, the way she had with me. But in this case, I believed she did it so I wouldn't know what she was telling him, or to reveal how she was influencing him, so I wouldn't interfere. Stuart's presence was torture to me. The blood that flowed through his veins, although sick, was very appealing. I tried to keep my mind off of the blood and focused on what my Lana was ultimately planning. About an hour and a half before dawn, my Lana stood and stretched. She walked over and sat beside me on the bed.
I brought him for you, you know. The bloodthirst must be unbearable.
Her voice tender, she said in a whisper that only I could hear. I don't want him. Please, let him go, I pleaded. My Lana looked at me for a second. I could see her growing impatience.
Look, if you keep this up, the state you are in now will only worsen,
she said, as caring as she could muster. I will choose who will die under my will and when. After killing that crude man in the tavern, or simply cannot. I will not take that boy's life. I was becoming excited, the volume of my voice elevating. Stuart looked over in our direction. He appeared calm, like he knew why he was there. The thought that he was willing both frightened and sickened me.
He's gonna die anyway. If we give him death, it will be peaceful and painless. He would probably thank us in the long run if he could.
I feel like I am dying, whether I kill or not. I bowed my head.
You feel guilty. That is what you feel.
A sigh escaped her lips.
Guilty that you did not feel any remorse for that man in the tavern like you did with your first kill. Every time you feed, you are reminded that you should feel pain for their death. Yet you did not with him because he possessed an evil spirit and had possibly killed also. The rapture that you felt in taking that man's life, that is what you are frightened of. Guilt is a poison, Deirdre. If you let yourself dwell on it, it will consume you wholly until you are unable to function. Guilt will alter everything you think and do until you are but a wisp of who you are and the breathtaking vampire you could be. Don't do this to yourself. Don't let the death of that wicked man who did deserve to die and go to the hell he belongs in hold you back.
What? The hell that we should be in? I said bitterly. I was quickly becoming frustrated with it all. Milena sat there, saying nothing, her eyebrows coming together and forming wrinkles above her nose, her mouth slightly agape. She was about to say something, but ceased to form any words. Milena cocked her head to the side, turning to look at Stuart, her facial expression back to her sweet self, and he limped his way over to us. He stood up against Milena, looking into her eyes, and they spoke to each other silently as before. After a short interval, Stuart slid over to me, pressing his fevered body against me. He looked down at me the same way he had with Milena, thinking he could talk with me in the same manner. If I could hear or talk to him, I couldn't that night. I wouldn't let his mind merge with my own. I was astonished that he wasn't afraid of us. He slowly came over to me, brushing his face against mine. The scent of his blood and salty skin seemed so much more intensified and filled my nostrils, teasing me unmercifully, testing my weakened limits. I pushed him away gently. He only looked up at me, his deep brown eyes crying out. Slowly he dared to come back to my side, bringing his lips to my ear and whispered,
"Drink."
My limbs froze. I could not believe what I had heard. He brought his face in front of mine, kissing me softly on the lips. Slowly he went down on his knees, giving himself up to me, turning his head to the side, exposing his pale neck. I cupped his chin and directed him closer to me, and I smothered him in kisses. Breathing in his intense scent, it instantly began to break down my willpower. In my mind, I could almost taste his blood. My mouth watered in anticipation. I pictured myself having him, letting my fangs push gently at first against his thin flesh, and then letting my fangs pierce the jugular. I could imagine the burst of warm, sweet, delectable blood spurting into my mouth. Realizing my thoughts had almost empowered me, I stopped caressing and kissing the boy. I had to distance myself from him. I could no longer be in the same room as him. I was going to give in. It was just a matter of how much longer before I would wholly give in. Standing abruptly, I caused Stuart to lose his balance, and he almost fell back onto the floor. I cannot do it! I looked around the room wildly for an escape, my vision blurred, tears threatening to consume me. Cannot! Not now! Not ever! I brushed past Stuart and stumbled toward the door. Milena quickly followed.
Stupid!
Milena shrieked, raising her arm, her hand clenched in a fist.
Why don't you just do it? It's in your nature. Is it any worse than killing a deer or a cow and feast upon their flesh?
Milena said furiously and grabbed me by the shoulders. Pain seared down my arms. I winced and tried to pull myself out of her grip, but it was useless. I could not move. She held on to me so tight. No! I yelled into her face. Finally, she released me. I brought my hands up to my shoulders and rubbed them to ease some of the pain. Milena walked away from me and towards Stuart, where she embraced him swiftly with no warning and no romance. I heard his heart slow. When she had taken enough, she let him fall to the floor, and his heart eventually ceased beating. I need time. I just need more time. My voice was weak and barely audible as I was mainly addressing myself. Milena glared at me.
Get rid of the body,
she said acrimoniously. I stood there stupidly, saying nothing. Her back confronted me as she stormed out the door, saying nothing else. As the door slammed shut, I jumped slightly. I looked over at Stuart's lifeless body and walked toward it and knelt beside him. Red hazed my vision as I took in the wretched sight before me. At that moment, I hated Milena with all my being. I hated that she found him. I hated that he was so willing to follow her. Why did she have to do this? I hated her for leaving him there. And most of all, I hated myself because, as his dead body lay before me, all I could really focus on was the fact that the scent of his lingering blood was so alluring. The blood that oozed from the wound on his neck glistened in the lamplight and taunted me in a way that was painfully cruel. Knowing what I was going to do next, I let myself leave the reality of it, and like an out-of-body experience, I watched myself reach out for his arm and brought my cool lips to his wrist, and I began to drink. His blood was still warm. As I drank, shame filled me, and love. Now fully weeping, I held on to Stuart's lifeless, cooling limb, and I was overrun with love for him, as the last of his blood eased my physical body and calmed my hunger. But with that love, shame twisted and formed around it until there was nothing left but my shame. Releasing his arm, letting it fall to his side, I looked down at the expired body of Stuart, drained of any color he had possessed earlier. A bluish gray now covered his face and other exposed flesh. I don't know how long I stared at his lifeless body, but as I began to feel the nearing dawn, it pulled me from my trance, and I shook my head in an attempt to clear my thoughts. I had work to do. I had to dispose of the body. The ship was quiet, except for those kept awake by their coughing. Quickly, I wrapped him in a nearby blanket, carried him to the upper deck, and gave him a seaman's burial. Once alone, I became furious with my Lana. She knew after being taunted by him, I would give in to my hunger once she left. Why couldn't she have been more supportive and helpful and not the spiteful woman I was learning she really was? But as I thought this, I knew deep down that what I did, what I chose to do, was ultimately me. The events gnawed at my conscience. Knowing this, I still let myself linger on my hatred for my Lana because selfishly, it made me feel better about myself. For the duration of the trip, I hardly spoke to my Lana. I could hardly stand to look at her. I fed on rats and the odd chicken, but mainly I fasted. I found no peace in any blood I drank, no ease of thirst. Nothing had meaning. Everything was a constant confusion now. Nothing made sense. I couldn't help but feel relief when the ship finally docked in Boston. It was mid to late December. I had lost track of the actual date weeks earlier, for some of those nights seemed to stand still and blended together. As we made our way off the ship, I was instantly in awe. The land was covered in snow, and the moonlight that shone its blue-white glow made the snow sparkle like millions of little pieces of glass were shattered over the vast, great land. It was so beautiful, and nothing like Ireland at all. This land was much flatter, much colder. The town was substantially larger and more populated, and with that, much louder. There were different sights and sounds to take in, and it was like a feast for the eyes and ears. I couldn't help but let the buzz that surround us absorb and take over my being. I enjoyed the new sensation of excitement. It had been a long time. Standing in the cold, I absorbed everything. There were still many people out and about, not just those coming off the ship. The sounds of laughter seemed to emanate from everywhere. People here seemed very happy. Or maybe it was just so long since I had heard the song of laughter that it seemed almost foreign to me. We hailed a carriage once our trunks were delivered to us, with my Lana telling the driver to take us to the nearest hotel. At our request, he dropped us off at an upper-class hotel and helped us with our trunks, for we were helpless young women in the New World, right? The hotel was filled with elegantly dressed, affluent women prancing around with their noses in the air, their tall powdered wigs adorning their heads, their faces painted white, and wide skirts that were just too ridiculously extravagant. All of them possessed arrogant thoughts, thinking each was better than the other. When my Lana and I walked past them, they would snicker, and under their breath would say that we didn't belong. Foreigners are filthy. They're making this once pristine city appalling and calamitous. All I would have to do was look them in the eye and their pace would quicken, which would leave me slightly satisfied. That night, my Lana quickly fed so she could hurry on to other business. I, on the other hand, strolled along only to feed on the odd rat, and as I wandered further out of the city lights to small farms, I came across a herd of sheep, and feeling the need for greater sustenance, I fed on a lamb. When I made my way back to the center of town, I found my Lana in a dress shop that was a block away from our hotel. As I strolled in, the dressmaker quickly looked to see who had entered his shop, and as he saw me, it was like he lost his train of thought and was instantly tongue-tied. I could hear his thoughts. It was like he was yelling at me.
This girl looks like the Walking Dead. My God, what if she has the plague? I gotta get her out of here.
My Lana cleared her throat to regain his attention, and it worked. Like magic, he went back to complaining that he had to close the store and wanted her to leave. I knew, and so did my Lana. It wasn't that he had to close the store for the night. He just didn't want to sell to a foreign woman who he thought had no culture and assumed she couldn't afford his dress. Being very persistent, he sighed, finally giving in to her, and sold Maylana a silk teal blue floral dress. It had lace around the cuffs and neckline, which was low cut and would reveal the curves of her breasts. The dress, an open robe, revealed the quilted petticoat that was a shade lighter than the rest of the dress. The man boxed it for her, and Maylana was happy. She grabbed hold of my left arm, intertwining it with her own, and together we walked out of the store.
So, did you enjoy your vermin, Deirdre?
Maylana asked cruelly. I wished she hadn't ruined the moment we were having. I wished she had never spoken at all. I didn't answer her, ignoring her comment.
You look horrible. You need to snap out of your stupidity and begin feeding again.
Arrogance mixed with concern filled her voice. I still ignored her, not wanting to hear any negative thoughts. Maylana shook her head, and a small sigh escaped her lips, and quickly changed the subject altogether.
Isn't this the most extravagant and exciting place?
Aye, 'tis, I agreed happily. Maylana was so much happier once we arrived in Boston, like her old self that I remember when first meeting her. She was so much more pleasant to be around, other than when she would voice her ruthless comments.
I found a better place to stay rather than that hotel. It is a quaint 2-story house. The elderly lady who owns it wants to let it out. She doesn't live there anymore, and her son wanted to sell it, so I talked them into letting it to us. Wonderful, isn't it?
Maylana said, grinning from ear to ear, her tiny fangs glistening in the moonlight. But what about money? How will we pay? I asked, genuinely concerned. I wondered if she had thought the whole idea through. I honestly didn't know what we were going to do. I had no money, and I was a dependent. I only hoped that Maylana had a king's ransom after seeing the lavish dress she had just purchased. Deep down, I knew she would head back to that dress shop and get her money and revenge on the dressmaker for his ill-willed thoughts toward me and herself. I couldn't help but be fearful. We couldn't go around killing for money and a place to make our home. We would easily be suspect for crime just because we were two lowly foreigners, which was one of many strikes against us. We could not afford to draw any attention.
Ah, yes. Money.
Maylana said, her head tilted to one side.
You would ask. You think things through so thoroughly.
She smiled at me, straightening her head.
Well, I thought we could work in the tavern. We won't have to worry about getting hurt now, will we?
She smirked. The tavern? Can't we earn money in a better place? I asked. Nausea engulfed me at the thought of working there. Spending time with drunkards revolted me. But she was right. No harm would be brought upon us. If any of the men tried anything I didn't like or allow, he would pay. But being near so many humans would make my life much more unbearable. Being 20 feet away from a human was hard enough. Intense as it was, I managed to control my insatiable thirst. I always stayed away from any human if I could help it. It had been just over 2 months without blood from a human, except for the little taste from Stuart.
Well, there isn't much choice of work for a woman, you know that. They will not hire a nurse that's not from here. You have no higher education. What else is there?
She asked, genuinely interested in a response. I knew that it bothered her as much as it did me. I thought for a moment, and it hit me. Dress as a man. Brilliant. A smile upon my face, I began to blurt out my idea. If I dress as a man, I could maybe work in a music shop and work on instruments, the harp being my asset. As I said it, I knew it would work. It had to. If I had to feed on 100 rats and whatever else to ease the thirst to make being with humans more bearable, I would do it. Yes, that is what I shall do. I had made up my mind. Standing there, I looked at Maylana, staring at me shocked.
But why?
She asked, her face twisted with curiosity. You know why. Men have more choice and opportunity. I began, still determined to continue with my idea. Suddenly, Maylana's expression changed.
Oh,
She gasped.
don't cut your hair.
She said under her breath. And why not? I asked, slightly irritated.
If you cut your hair, you will have to do so every night, for it will grow back. While you sleep, it will return to the length it was the night I gave you my blood.
I stared at her, considering what she had said, and shrugged my shoulders. So my hair will grow back. I shall just have to cut it every night. I was still very determined to follow through with what I thought was an excellent idea. Milana said no more to deter me and began walking back to the hotel. The next night, Milana had gone out early to schedule our move and to hunt. She was back in only a few hours and was surprised to see me in the hotel room. Still wearing my nightdress, I hadn't even left yet to attempt to feed on the vermin. At this point, I even began to ponder on settling for an ill vagabond. Even though I began to have many daydreams of feeding on humans, I never gave in to it. My body now seemed to have surpassed the urgency of it, and I felt like I was in a state of hibernation. Even though I still had the need and want for blood, my body was no longer responding as it should or had been. I could see the worry in Milana's eyes, but for once she stayed silent and did not harass me. I was grateful for that, but also concerned. I could feel Milana's anxiety and worry for me. I wanted to tell her that I was fine, that I would be fine, but I couldn't. A few times she had started to make small talk, and it always began to take a turn toward me and feeding. But she always stopped and either changed the subject or remained quiet altogether. Finally, Milana settled on distracting herself with her painting as I read. Suddenly I began to feel sharp pains in my chest and stomach. It was an annoyance that I tried to ignore at first, but it persisted, becoming strong and more painful. Soon it felt like fire had engulfed my insides. I bent over, my arms cradling my stomach. I heard a distant thud. Slowly I realized it was my book that had fallen to the floor. Swiftly Milana was by my side and grabbed me gently by the shoulders, lifting me up so she could look upon my face. "What's wrong? What in damnation is happening to me?" I shrieked. My head throbbed, my veins seemed to cave in, and my eyes felt as though being pierced by daggers.
You need blood. Human blood. You've been too long without it. Look at yourself. You're becoming the monstrous thing that you do not want to be or look like. Deirdre, believe me, I know. Please, feed.
Milana said desperately. The pain became so intense. Thinking back now, I do not know how I survived it. It was worse than the night I died. "Make it stop! Make it go away!" I sobbed, tears streaming down my face.
You have to feed, and not on animals. You know that.
Milana coaxed. "Fine, anything! Just make it go away!" I begged. Looking up at her, my tears streamed down my face.
Let's go.
She grabbed my arm and pulled me out of the chair where I sat by the fire. Once on my feet, she wrapped her arm around my shoulders. Her embrace felt warm despite the fact that her skin was cool. As we walked past the side table, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the mirror that hung above it. I stopped abruptly, forcing Milana to pause as well. The sight of me sent terror throughout my ice-cold body. My cheeks and eyes appeared sunken. Bluish veins seemed to bulge like tiny ropes beneath my white marble-like flesh, and the irises of my eye were a pale crystal blue. The blood vessels that were very apparent were like tiny red cracks that spread all throughout the white of my eye, appearing bloodshot. To me, I looked like a monster, but I knew that if a mortal were to cross my path, my appearance to them would only be alarming and not fully frightening. In reality, the changes were subtle, but in my eyes, it was tremendous and revolting. Milana pulled me forcefully away from the mirror.
No, don't look. And don't remember. Only remember that you have to feed to survive, and to do so regularly. Feed on the miscreant, on the sick and dying. Act like God, for we are dead, and life is something we both take,
she said while dressing me in my cloak and lifting the hood to hide my monstrous face. We walked the cobblestone streets of Boston, making our way over to the only ferry to travel to Charlestown, where most of the Irish immigrants made their home. That night, Milana was like my mother, bringing to me easily those for me to feast upon. I fed with no remorse, feeling a peace which I had not felt in such a long time. It was like something new all over again. I still did not like taking a life, but that night, Milana taught me how to feed from a mortal and have them survive. I was on to my third victim, and Milana figured my bloodlust had been subdued enough to teach me my next lesson, for there would have been no way that I'd have any power over my self-control earlier.
Just drink a little. Stop when the heart begins to slow,
she coaxed as I fed on a young man. Hearing as his heart began to slow and beat more erratic, I pulled back and looked down at the boy, then up at Milana, who watched with a slight smile on her face. But won't they remember what happened to them?
Ah, but that's the beauty of what we are. You have the ability to enter the mind of a mortal. You can make them remember what you want, or nothing at all. You can have them do what you want. If you concentrate solely on one person, you can sense what they are thinking. Yet the gifts we all have are different from every vampire alive, but also similar. Do you understand?
I only nodded, making sure I stored this lesson in my brain and remembered all that she had said. I learned a lot from my Lana that night. If not for that lesson, I do believe that I would not have survived. But with that said, every time I used my new abilities, it fixed the fact that I was unnatural and inhuman. Early on, I knew I was capable of hearing the mortal mind clearly, but it wasn't until this lesson that I fully registered the extent of my power over them. I have often wondered from that night forward why my Lana had chosen more times than not to kill her victims. I had tried to query her on that matter, but it irritated her and I was given no real answers. I couldn't help but feel that my ability to wield a mortal's mind was greater than hers, but I would never say that aloud to her. For a year, I worked as a man in a music shop making harps just a block away from our 2-story house on Cornhill where my Lana and I lived. With my new job, I learned how to play the harpsichord and flute. It was quite easy to learn the fingering, scales, and arpeggios, and how to read and write music with greater skill. One of my best students. Never saw anyone learn so fast, my employer gushed to everyone. In just a few weeks, I was teaching others. My ever-growing knowledge in music, art, and writing seemed never-ending. It all held such a fascination with me, ever-changing like the world and life that surrounded me. My nights were filled with music and passion. Men and women would come to the shop and ask for me by name, Aidan O'Day, to have lessons with me. Some I would share my deep erotic kisses with, the ones I found beautiful and knowledgeable, and they would leave me lightheaded, blissful, and with no ill memory, and still enthralled with me. Life with my Lana, on the other hand, became tedious. I wanted to travel more, see other cities like New York and Philadelphia. She wanted nothing to do with anything I suggested, and would go off alone someplace to pout. Life in general was like clockwork now. Wake, work, feed, and head home for the rest of the night, only to watch my Lana sulk. New adventures ceased. The only thrill I received was when I would taunt and kill the cutthroats who tried to kill me and take my purse in the dark alleyways. No one ever noticed or appeared to care about their deaths, but the odd time an article would appear in the newspaper about a cutthroat drained of his blood, but no murderer found, and all would be forgotten in a few days. During this time, my Lana became withdrawn from me. We never talked or walked down the streets together to enjoy the life and beauty that surrounded us. When I asked her to explain why she was acting the way she did, she would become furious with me.
Just leave me alone. Don't talk to me. You're becoming a pest.
If you would just tell me, you might feel better. Be the way you used to be, I would pry. Milana would just throw the nearest thing at me and scream for me to leave, and I would do as she requested. I know I had my moments in the past, and I figured that she was allowed to have hers, but I assumed since I cared enough to try and help that it would fix things. I was wrong. It seemed like there wasn't anything I could say to make her feel better. It was like she resented me for being there. I couldn't help but be hurt, but also confused by her words and actions. One evening, Milana began to weep hysterically. I was unable to calm her. It came out of nowhere and was rather unexpected. Milana, tell me what's wrong. I may be able to help, I said, desperation coloring my words. Seeing her like that was terrifying to me. She sat there sobbing quietly, her shoulders trembling.
Deirdre, please, I don't know anymore.
Looking up at me, her eyes were wild. Faint red streaked down her white cheeks. I reached out for her, embracing and comforting her as she had done for me. Tell me. If you tell me, maybe it'll lift some of the burden or guilt that you feel. Please, you must let me help you, I said softly, gently rocking her back and forth in my arms. Her crying had died down, and she seemed to have gotten a hold of her emotions. She gently pulled herself out of my embrace and wiped her face with a satin handkerchief she had scrunched in her hand. She looked at me for a while, silently, pondering what I had asked of her. As she began to speak, her thoughts quickly flowed over me, her voice soft, disappearing, and the imagery of her story enveloped me.